want to add my welcome to Bell's. We're also glad that you're here with us this evening as our guest, and we hope you'll come back and visit at your leisure in the future. As always, before we get to this evening's program, and as Bell mentioned, I want to take a moment to recognize the Mamie McFaddin-Ward Heritage Foundation, whose generosity funds literally everything we do here at the museum, making all of our programs and activities free and open to the public. We have with us this evening several members of our board. I see Roy Steinhagen is with us. Mitch Smith is with us. Leslie Wilson, our board president, is with us. And I hope I didn't miss anybody else. But we owe them our thanks for their leadership here at the museum. I'm happy to report that TripAdvisor, the world's largest travel guidance platform, has named the McFaddin-Ward House the top-rated attraction in Beaumont, number 1 of 54 things to do in Beaumont, a ranking we're extremely proud to claim. Since I've been here for the past 4 or 5 years, Gator Country has claimed that honor, and so I don't know if it says great things about what we're doing here or bad things about what Gator Country's been doing, but at any rate, we're really happy to have that ranking. And in that regard, anytime you have friends or family in town visiting, we hope you'll bring them by for a free tour of the house and the carriage house. And speaking of TripAdvisor, the National WWII Museum is the top-rated tourist attraction in New Orleans. And get this, the number 2 rated tourist destination in the United States, second only to Central Park in New York City, according to TripAdvisor. The National WWII Museum offers an unforgettable way to experience World War II, from industrial efforts on the home front to the combat experience of the American service member abroad. Offering a compelling blend of sweeping narrative and poignant personal detail, the museum features immersive exhibits, multimedia experiences, and an expansive collection of artifacts and first-person oral histories to take visitors inside the story of the war, why it was fought, how it was won, and what that means today. Beyond the galleries, the museum offers unique access to experiential history, including an opportunity to tour and ride on an authentically restored PT boat, tours behind the scenes to handle artifacts with museum curators, and an impressive collection of restored and working artifacts to discover. This evening, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Bell, the Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National WWII Museum. Commissioned in armor following graduation from West Point, Dr. Bell is a combat veteran, historian, and strategist who has served at every level of the armed forces, from platoon through theater army, as well as the U.S. Central Command, the Joint Staff, West Point faculty, and the National Defense University. As a civilian faculty member at the National Defense University, he also served details to the Office of the Secretary of State and as National Security Council Senior Director and Special Assistant to the President of the United States. Dr. Bell holds both a master's and doctorate in American history from the University of Maryland, as well as an MS in National Security Strategy from the National Defense University, where he was a distinguished graduate of the National War College. His awards and decorations include Distinguished Service Medal, 2 awards of the Defense Superior Service Medal, a Bronze Star, Joint Staff Badge, and Combat Action Badge. Please welcome Dr. Michael Bell.
Well, thank you for that. I always feel a little embarrassed by that intro, but I think my mom would be happy. And so good evening. Thanks for coming. Haven't been in Beaumont for 22 years. I was stationed at then Fort Hood. We brought the kids down to see the butterflies, probably back in 2002. And, obviously been on other adventures since then. But I'm Dr. Mike Bell. I'm in the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National WWII Museum. Yes, it is the Jenny Craig. She was a teenager that grew up in New Orleans during World War II, and her two brothers were in the war. Her dad literally fixed Navy ships just a couple blocks from where the museum is today, and wanted to do something to celebrate that, but also something for her hometown. And I'd like to talk this evening about the decisive role that the American home front, and American politics and industry played in the Allied victory in World War II over Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. So before we go too far, are there any World War II veterans or home front workers with us tonight? Well, they may be watching at home, so why don't we give them a round of applause? And then any veterans or active duty service men and women from any era? How about if you stand up or raise your hand and be recognized? Let's thank you as well. And I just give a shout out to the family members. There used to be an old bumper sticker, Army wife, toughest job in the Army. For those family members, you certainly enabled those service members to do what they did. And, usually it's pretty darn thankless. So thank you for that as well. And it really, really is appreciated. And I think it'll fit closely with the theme we have tonight about, the home front in World War II and how this really mobilized America for victory. So let me start a little bit. Who here has been to the National World War II Museum? Oh, man. Okay. So you know all about it. Who's been there in the last year? Okay, you're pretty fun too. All right. And so we can talk all about it. But what I'm going to do is I'll talk about a couple aspects. As Tony mentioned, here's our mission. Tell the story of the American experience in the war that changed the world. Why it's fought, how it's won, what it means today. And then importantly, why we're doing that. So we can understand the price of freedom, but also be inspired by that. And, I think our goal is to tell the story, warts and all, but also even with those warts, we can be inspired by what was achieved by this country. So, this is just the one gallery. It gives you a peek into the Boeing Pavilion, obviously from the other side, but pretty cool. So why New Orleans? The genesis of the museum in New Orleans, because this is always the question, why New Orleans? It kind of goes back to a comment that then ex-President Eisenhower made to Stephen Ambrose. This is back in the 1960s. Ambrose is a young professor at the University of New Orleans, and he's one of the editors of the Eisenhower papers. And former President Eisenhower said, "Oh, you're in New Orleans. You must know Andrew Higgins." He said, "Well, no, Andrew Higgins died in 1952. And Eisenhower then says, "Well, he's the man who won the war for us." Oh, here you are. Imagine you're a young historian. You think you know everything, and you didn't know that. How is it that Andrew Higgins won the war? And Eisenhower's view is without Higgins Industries' mass production of assault flat-bottom landing craft, you could not have had D-Day or the other 160 amphibious assaults that the United States conducted in the war. The projection of power is just not possible without that. And so that innovation is pretty incredible. Now, Stephen Ambrose, when he's writing his D-Day book, a lot of people gave him stuff. And, like most historians, he kept it in the garage or in the house. And his wife's like, "Hey, you got to get this stuff out of here," right? And so he imagined they would start this little museum up at the University of New Orleans up by the lake. Maybe it'd be one room. And, they'd have all the stuff in there. And then he also tried to get it in Washington, D.C. This is the 1980s, 1990s, and there's really no interest in D.C. to have a museum. And then fortunately, some advisors prevailed on him and said, if you have it up at University of New Orleans up by the lake, no one's going to go there. It needs to be down in the city where it's accessible. And so, serendipitously, that's what happened, And then the grand opening on D-Day, in 2000. Had a pretty amazing group, veterans, Secretary of Defense, really an incredible piece there. But it's interesting enough, just the day before the opening, Senator Stevens from Alaska is like, hey, I'm glad you're telling the D-Day story, but we need you to tell the whole story of the war. No pressure, right? You think you've made it? And then suddenly, not only do they expand, but they really expand. This is a huge war. And so Congress in 2004 declares the museum to be the National World War II Museum. There's your mandate, which is great. But in good congressional fashion, they also didn't appropriate any money for it, which is good because then we're not on any other strings in terms of the story that we tell. But, and so that started a grand plan. And they created a master plan then. Fortunately, they created it in a way, instead of one giant building, they thought, wouldn't it make more sense to have different pavilions with different aspects of the war, and then the museum can grow over time. This is a really important decision because when Katrina hit, suddenly it's like, hey, do we fold up? Do we go back to being just D-Day, or do we keep at it? And so the decision was made to kind of keep at it and eventually produce the whole World War II museum. And, kind of this pattern starts, of expansion beyond the D-Day Museum. They created D-Days in the Pacific, Solomon Victory Theater. There's a restoration pavilion that's super cool. The PT boat's actually in there now, too, because it was a wooden boat that was out on Lake Pontchartrain during COVID. You can imagine the boat needed some work. So they took the wall off. The PT boat's in there. We've got some incredible pieces like the amphibious tractor and some stuff like that. And this will be used for STEM for kids. And then the Boeing Center, this is the other side of it. You can see at the top there is the B-17. It was recovered out of Greenland, hanging from the roof. Just the engineering of it alone is pretty incredible. And then Campaigns of Courage features the Road to Berlin and the Road to Tokyo, the kind of two major campaigns or theaters the Americans fought in. Arsenal and Democracy, we'll talk a bit about it this evening. Hall Democracy is focused on the educational mission to include research library, and soon we'll open up archival reading room and some places like that for more research. And then across the street is the Higgins Hotel and Conference Center. Of course, it opened up like a month before COVID hit. Probably not really great in terms of the business model, but in terms of accessibility, both for educational programs, but also for people visiting, it's amazing. And then the Canopy of Peace was intended to be an iconic piece that really brings together the whole museum campus. And then this just kind of gets you a sense in there, Beyond All Boundaries, kind of a 4D experience about the war. Really a great opportunity for folks aren't familiar with it to give them an overview. Road to Berlin, this one shows in the center the gallery of the Bulge, the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes. I really like that one because I've had a couple veterans from the Bulge come up and say, who was your advisor on that? Because it feels exactly right, except it's not cold enough. But even one guy turned to his granddaughter and said, this is exactly how it felt. So if we can capture some of that feel, it's kind of elusive, but imagine if we can capture that and then put their oral histories and the artifacts within that context. It can be amazingly powerful, I believe. And the Road to Tokyo, this one depicts the Guadalcanal aspect. And then this fall we opened Liberation Pavilion, which we certainly can talk about as well. And then one of the pieces that we have over the years, it builds on the oral histories that Stephen Ambrose started. We've got 12,000 right now. About a quarter of these are available to the public on the website, but the others are available for researchers at the museum. And the goal over time is to transcribe those, and those, amazing testimony. Those also include home front workers, Holocaust survivors, other folks like that. So a pretty amazing resource about the war. And then here's our goal, our vision for the future. How can we become the most accessible, but also the most trusted source on World War II? I think those are important goals for us. And so with that, I'm going to talk about the triumph. The U.S. triumph in World War II is not exclusively about the battlefield, but really a triumph of what happens here at home in the production, domestic politics. And FDR lays out a vision in 1940 that the United States would be what he called the arsenal of democracy. And to that end, American economy proved incredibly robust to produce weapons and supplies of all sorts in absolutely unimaginable quantities. The quantities, I think, are beyond what we can imagine, but not just for the United States, but for all the allies who are resisting aggression. Was the war won in places like Midway, Guadalcanal, Normandy? Absolutely. But it also was won in places like Cleveland and Birmingham and the shipyards, machine shops, refineries of Beaumont. So let's set the stage for that to understand the role of American industry in the outcome of World War II. Sound good? Everybody, did anyone come to the wrong place? So, first you got to kind of frame this. To understand how the war transforms America, we got to understand what America's like before the war. And so, the nation was completely suffering from the Great Depression, and the war is going to convert it to the engine of the world economy by the end of 1945. So to give you an idea, if we think about $1929, which is the year of the Wall Street crash, the U.S. had a gross domestic product, GDP, of $100 billion. So that's a nice, easy number, $100 billion. You guys probably all are into business. You'll remember this, right? $100 billion. All right? Now, as the Depression hit harder, the U.S. economy collapsed to $56 billion of GDP. And then, unemployment soared by 1933 to 25% of the workforce. I mean, it's kind of unimaginable, I think, to us as we think through those numbers. But 1933 is also the year Franklin D. Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler came to power in their respective countries. So, what happens? Now, when Germany invades Poland in September 1939, American GDP once again reaches $100 billion. But you could say, oh my gosh, after this decade of lost productivity, it's the same level, but it's really not, because the American population had grown. And so you don't even achieve that. In fact, American unemployment is still 17% in 1940. And so, the Depression is really long-lasting and incredibly hard hit. Arguably the American South, it's even worse. These are kind of national perspectives. Now, a couple other things to frame this, because this house here is pretty amazing. It's got heat, running water. In 1940, only 1/3 of American houses had running water. Now, think of this other number. This one's pretty crazy, I think. 48,000 taxpayers out of a population of 132 million, only 48,000 earn more than $2,500 a year. That would be the equivalent of about $40,000, $45,000 today. I mean, the Depression has really, really hit the country hard. So, how's that? Is that everybody good? It's pretty staggering. I think of my grandparents as they moved through that. Now, you think about it, this gives you some images. You start to produce, Civilian Conservation Corps, Major Works Project Administration. These put people to work, and to an extent they have faith in the American system, but it doesn't solve the prosperity problem as you move forward. And so I think sometimes people think, well, the New Deal solved the Depression. And, arguably that it's still pretty elusive. American prosperity is still lagging behind. But in 1939 then, in September, Nazi Germany, is going to invade Poland, and this will dash all the hopes of avoiding another major European war. Certainly the war in Asia has been going on. Japan moved into Manchuria in 1931. 1937, they invade China. And so, this whole piece is pretty bad. But then in early 1940, Germany's going to strike again into Norway and then into the Low Countries. And then we'll take France out of the war in a lightning campaign. Now, France had started orders before they fall out of the war, and then Britain will continue those war orders. And so unemployment in the United States will drop for the first time below 10% just prior to Pearl Harbor in 1941. So we're getting there a little bit. Of course, Pearl Harbor and American entry of the war is going to accelerate that, particularly as you commit everybody to this national effort. So let me summarize a couple statistics that I think kind of lay this out. And there's not a test on this afterwards, so you're okay. Always had to have a test, but you're okay. In 1944, unemployment reaches an all-time low in American history of 1.2%. Imagine that. You've gone from 17% to 1.2% in literally a couple years. I mean, pretty amazing. The American GDP at the end of the war, 1945, is $240 billion. Now, what does that mean? That was 50% of the world GDP. We had 60% of the world's shipping and 2/3 of the world's gold supply. There's a transformation. It's pretty incredible when you go from those numbers. So this is an unprecedented moment of world economic superiority that's happened as a result of this war. So how does that happen? How did we get there? So this is one of the galleries. Obviously, many of you have seen it. I really like it. It's kind of a little assembly line. Here in the middle, you see this vehicle. Some of you know it as a Jeep, right? It actually wasn't a Jeep. It's a general purpose vehicle, GP, that of course became Jeep as we turn all things American into a word. But there's the general purpose vehicle. But, so we opened this gallery in 2017. It's about the mobilization of the American people, our industrial potential, but also the lead up to war, why the wars fought, and the challenges up through Pearl Harbor. And, then this kind of immerses them toward the end after we've mobilized people, life on the home front. But it really sets out this kind of vast effort that supplies really weapons, transportation, raw materials, food, to decisively defeat our enemies. And that's, I think, an important piece that sometimes a lot of young folks don't appreciate, that the role that America had. But this arsenal of democracy, we might focus on the outputs, is really a product of people. People are what makes this possible. And it's this human dimension, everybody from corporate leaders, government leaders, on down through the ranks of managers, but also workers and farmers that have a contribution to make this happen. So we'll talk about some of those. Certainly, we have kind of a saw in American history that, wars are kind of an away game. But in this one, everybody on the home front has to make sacrifices, whether it's through rationing of food and energy supplies, consumer products such as automobiles. For new automobiles are suspended during the war. The plants are converted to make cool stuff: tanks, trucks, machine guns, ships, spare parts. Even Frigidaire is making M2 machine guns. If you think of that, Motorola, of course, makes walkie-talkies. Everybody is converted into that. Hershey is going to make this little thing that Tootsie Rolls. How can I have chocolate that doesn't melt that we can ship around the world, and allow them to continue that. Now, the government also encourages housewives to practice self-sufficiency, recycle fats and oils. Those that are too old or too young to work would contribute with victory gardens, scrap metal drives, and purchasing government war bonds, or, advocating for that, or working the Red Cross. Now, many of the old World War I vets manned the Civil Defense Force. Kind of forgotten, but they're the ones that did the air raid shelters and the lights out. The Civil Air Patrol as well. I thought it was noteworthy. Base 10 here in Beaumont of the Civil Air Patrol logged 14,000 hours of anti-submarine patrols over the Gulf of Mexico. So, in the first 6 months of the war, we had nearly 500 ships sunk off the coast of the United States and in the Gulf of Mexico by German submarines. And so this is an incredibly important aspect that we don't necessarily think about, And so, yeah, it's them too. And so it's also the power of people in a pretty creative enterprise as we go forward. So, here we got the Roosevelts sitting in the White House. What do we do about this? When the war breaks out, Roosevelt's concerned about what would happen to America, our prosperity, and our democratic institutions if Nazi Germany wins and dominates the world. Even if they don't invade America, who will America trade with? How will we get prosperity again if we don't have markets? And I think we don't necessarily think about it because we don't think about the dire economic straits of the country before the war as well. But he also believed that the United States could have a positive impact on the outcome of the war, both before we enter the war and after we enter the war. I think that's an important piece, that he believes America can make a difference. Now, he thought that if France and Britain had actually bought more first-class airplanes before the war, that could have dissuaded Hitler and made a difference. Of course, they didn't. Their production was pretty late. But he also believed that weapons such as that, American advanced aircraft, ships, naval power, could have great utility if the United States got drawn into the war. And so the American production serves both sides of that, both the deter war and aid the Allies, but also potentially to prepare America. But a key part of that is you've got to keep those people in the war in the meantime. Now, Roosevelt certainly followed events pretty closely. Then in March 1940, he called for the production of 10,000 aircraft a month. Now, let's think about this number. The Army Air Corps in 1939 had 1,700 airplanes, of which only a third were considered not obsolete. So usually it'd be the biplanes, like in the Fay Ray movies. Those were not first-class planes. They had some great designs, but not that many. So imagine, the president comes out and says that. So, of course, Hap Arnold, the head of the Air Corps, thinks this isn't feasible. In private, he's going to say this is kind of a publicity stunt. And so that doesn't go where. Then Germany will invade France in May 1940, a couple months later. FDR is going to return to this theme. He calls for the production of 50,000 aircraft for the war. And, of course, he has his people don't believe him. He also calls for the first peacetime draft and signs into law the Two-Ocean Navy Act. Before there had been an Atlantic fleet, and the idea is now is how can you have two fleets, an Atlantic fleet and a Pacific fleet, so that you can have the dominant fleet in the world. Now, plenty of people doubted all this was possible. Remember that 50,000 number, though. We'll come back to that. I told you there wouldn't be a test. So it'll be a little test. But so FDR's challenge is you got to find people that can make this vision a reality. I mean, if you don't put the resources, human and otherwise, behind it, the vision isn't much, right? You got to turn it into something that can work. So as this concern gets closer, in May 1940, Roosevelt calls a fellow named Bernard Baruch. Now, Bernard Baruch ran the War Industry Board in World War I and was responsible for American industrial mobilization for that war. FDR had been in the administration then, so he calls up Bernard and say, would you consider returning to serve in the same capacity again to help us? Bernard says, hey, I'm too old. There's no way. So FDR says, hey, can you tell me who are the top 3 production men in the United States? And reportedly, Bernard Baruch says, first, Knudsen, second, Knudsen, third, Knudsen. So who's Big Bill Knudsen? Big Bill Knudsen, at the time, was the president of General Motors. He's kind of an American success story. Came to America as a Danish immigrant in 1900. Had about $30 in his pocket, which is probably not bad then. Worked on the docks of New York City. Ends up in Buffalo making bicycles. And then will become the production line expert for Henry Ford. running the production line of those new Model A's after World War I. As you think of cranking those out, it's really a pretty amazing idea. But he's focused on this engineering revolution, on how to move products and machinery and people through an assembly line in a factory to really change the way it was, rather than, kind of everybody comes together, or, doesn't take a month to make a car if you use an assembly line. It's not like a single artist doing that. Now, FDR calls him at the end of May in 1940. Of course, his CEO at General Motors doesn't like FDR, thinks he's a socialist. So Knudsen immediately resigns. He had a $300,000 a year job, which in 1940 would have been incredible. But he resigns to come work without salary and legal basis as a volunteer for the U.S. government. Now, of course, the government lawyers immediately get involved and say, well, you can't work as a volunteer for the government. So FDR comes up with the idea, we're going to pay him $1. He becomes the first $1-a-year man. He gets $1 for his job to help with production in America. And then later, they'll directly commission him in the Army. But so he's got to overcome all these kind of federal processes, jumpstart stuff from the Depression, how are defense contracts bid, how are companies taxed, how do we incentivize companies saying yes and actually, piloting new stuff. It all sounds good, doesn't it? Literally changes the way the government does business in 1940 and 41, convincing companies to really create new products they'd never created. It's like Frigidaire making machine guns. But also, he does it really with personal persuasion and a handshake, which is pretty incredible. The power of your reputation and your word. But I think it's a great story of what one person can do to make a difference in this process. Now, FDR is concerned, how long will it take to mobilize American industry to a war footing? And Knudsen does some calculations and says, hey, it's going to take 18 months before the American economic machine's ready. Okay, now if you're a conspiracy theorist, 18 months later is Pearl Harbor. On the other side, thankfully, you start the mobilization 18 months before Pearl Harbor so that it actually makes a difference. Now, let's talk a little bit about FDR himself. He's going to come up with the title of The Arsenal of Democracy. December 29, 1940, really lays the groundwork of continuing aid to Britain and the other countries fighting the Germans to keep them fighting. By this point, the British Empire is pretty broke. How do you keep them in the war, and how do you keep the production working? Now, he believes that the American industry can not only produce all the weapons and equipment that we need, but also what the Allies fighting aggression can have as well. Now, this is counter to George Marshall and Hap Arnold's advice. They tell him we can't do it. We can only rearm ourselves, and we shouldn't keep our allies doing that. So, it's pretty interesting how he kind of goes against the best professional advice, and ultimately for good ends as you move forward. Now, in his thinking, there's a direct connection. The strength of American democracy at home also is tied to the preservation of democracy abroad. And obviously, losing this war would ultimately threaten democracy both abroad and at home. And so, hence the term. Now, this really does require a united effort by all citizens, to achieve it. So let me give you a sense of what that does. But it also is going to bring about, pretty incredible social changes in America. Now, first, think about the numbers that go into the military. The U.S. military in 1939 has 335,000 in uniform. There's 7,000 women, Army nurses mostly, a few Navy nurses, but 335,000 total. By the end of 1945, there's 16 million in uniform. Holy cow, how do you do that? Where do you train them? How do you feed them? Where do you get uniforms? What equipment? How do you employ them? Where do you find the leaders? Imagine those numbers. It's crazy. So, 16 times what our military is today. Now, at the same time, now some of those are, here in Beaumont, the men part of the Texas National Guard, 36th Division, the Tea Patchers, they're going to deploy to North Africa and Italy. Women will become nurses or join the Women's Army Corps. It's commanded by Ovita Culp Hobby. You think of Hobby Airport, that's named for her husband, not for her, but it's still pretty incredible. But, in addition to those millions, now you've taken those people out of a labor force as you're trying to mobilize the industry. 17 million Americans will move during this war to take new defense jobs. And so you have the population is really moving around to an extent that, you haven't seen much. And for many, after the Depression, these jobs are really the first steady paycheck that they've ever received. And so on one hand, you can say it's a lot of challenges. On the other, you could go, hey, had a steady job. My grandma worked in what was the Presto pressure cooker factory, making artillery fuses. And it was just the way it worked. Now, just under 500,000 are estimated to have migrated into Texas. Usually, you talk about they move north to industrial jobs. Over 450,000 people are going to move just into Texas to take into this increase in industrial jobs here in Texas. Texas manufacturing will experience a fourfold increase. Beaumont Industries were really part of this boom as well. The Pennsylvania shipyards. I don't know why it's called Pennsylvania. I never figured that out. Someday. You got the petrochemical industries, synthetic rubber. The Japanese have overrun all the rubber sources in the world. Also of natural quinine. So you've got this demand for a lot of these industries. Magnolia Refinery. They all thrive in the war. I'll give you an example. The Pennsylvania shipyard went from several hundred workers to over 9,000. They built 71 cargo ships just here in Beaumont. Many of these, they sound, cargo ships. Well, what are they? They use them for the island hopping campaign in the Pacific as ammo ships and what they called attack class cargo ships, as well as minesweepers. So it's a pretty amazing piece. Cranking out 71 ships is pretty incredible, right? Now, during the war, 6 million women are going to move into industrial jobs. This is something that hadn't happened in America before. More than half of them are married women, which was kind of unprecedented. You wouldn't have seen married women in the workforce then. About 2 million women, though, will remain in the workforce after the war. So not everyone's forced out when the men come home. Others, do gradually. You've got the iconic Rosie the Riveter. You certainly had the Rosies here as well. The woman on the right's a welder at the Pennsylvania shipyards here in Beaumont. Probably, I don't know the exact numbers, but probably a third to 40%, typically in most of the major industries, were women by 1944. So, it's really a dimension that's pretty incredible. Another piece that you have in the summer of 1941, Roosevelt seeks to ban racial discrimination in defense work. Now, he knows he can't change the law about segregation, or doesn't think he can, but instead he issues an executive order, 8802, that bans discrimination in defense work, which means equal pay, equal work, men, women, African Americans, whites, all together, same assembly line. As you can imagine, some parts of the country that could be challenging. We'll talk about that. But that's one of the things we found in the Higgins factories in New Orleans. It was really very transformative for the community after the war, that experience. So that leads into a side note here, which I think is important to highlight here in Beaumont. Despite this overall positive kind of trajectory of production, right, there's significant tensions and pressures in society. People move, they take on new jobs, people come from outside. Imagine you come here and you go, hey, why are black men or women holding that job? Why shouldn't I get that? Or, 80,000 people flood into Beaumont in the first year of the war. Where do they live? What type of housing and transportation and stuff? And so, as you can imagine, tensions can get high at times. The Ku Klux Klan really wanted in the summer of 1943 to disrupt a planned Juneteenth celebration in Beaumont. And so really kicked off a wave of violence, relatively short, but ultimately there's some mob violence that will leave 3 dead, 200 injured, and destroys 150 black homes and businesses here in Beaumont. So I don't want to leave you the impression that somehow that as everybody's moving, there's not significant tensions. You see, potential, riots in the Ford Motor Company factories and all those. But it's an aspect, maybe you guys know about that, but if not, that's why we're here, right? Now let me go back to the museum and the Higgins boat. The Higgins boat, Andrew Jackson Higgins sets a boat initially to move cypress out of the swamps so he can sell cypress. And so you need a flat bottom boat that's not going to get tangled up. And then there's a young Marine. Any Marines here? Young Marine named Krulak, who comes back from the Far East in 1937, having seen that the Japanese had a ramp on the front of some of their boats. And he says, you could put a ramp on the front of those boats, and they do. Of course, that young Marine captain took them a while to do it, but they experiment with it on Lake Pontchartrain, and ultimately they're going to make over 20,000 landing craft in New Orleans, along with PT boats and all this other stuff. So again, how do you project power against dug-in enemy shores without assault landing craft? And part of it is a process. Higgins is building these boats and modifying them before there's any official war contracts. Imagine that they would kind of take this. Hey, we had a handshake that you needed these, and we're going to move forward with it. It's kind of an interesting idea today as we think about how do you do that as you go forward. So that's the Higgins boat. Certainly there's other types of landing craft. There's a barge in the background. There's larger ones, landing ship tank that could hold, tanks. But these are the ones for the assault infantry. Usually hold 32. They claim 36 infantry. You see this on, Saving Private Ryan right at the beginning there. How do you rapidly assemble forces ashore in this effort? And to give you a notion, for the assault troops, like several of the companies on D-Day, they have over 90% casualties in the company. So, this is really a critical piece on how you rapidly try to overwhelm defenders that outnumber you in this process. So, we're going to talk about this, though. So, Higgins Industries, interesting enough, it's an integrated workforce, men, women, white, black, is actually going to receive a banner similar to this. This is the Army-Navy E for Excellence Award. And it's given every 6 months in the war. First, the Navy started it. So, Navy, thank you. They had a Navy Excellence Award, and then they turned it into an Army-Navy one. The most somebody could get, this shows 5 awards because you'd get the pennant. They would fly it underneath their national flag at the thing, but they'd also, a lot of these companies would have it in their advertisements in the war. Hey, Cadillac, there's our little flag. Well, why would they do that? What did it mean? Now, there's about 85,000 American companies that participate in the war effort with contracts. 5% of them will earn one of these flags. So about 4,300. Now, it's not a freebie. Oh, that's coming up. Not a freebie. This is supposed to be about the quality and quantity of production. So how many rounds did you produce? How many ships? The quality. I mean, you think about that. That's the thing with all these defense contracts today. What are the problems with it? But also efficiency, timely results, fair labor standards, labor relations, absentee rate, no accidents. So it's a pretty tough piece there. And then a second award could be for every 6 months, you might be eligible for a subsequent award. Now in Beaumont, I'll probably say this wrong, the Onstad Machine Works earned this award. What's that? Homestead. Okay, thanks. See, I knew I had to say it wrong, so that's why it's crowd participation. The Booth's Sheet Metal Works earned 3 awards, which is pretty incredible. And then the Beaumont Iron Works was earned 5, which have been same as this. Was one of only 520 companies in the U.S. so recognized. So out of 85,000, they're one of a really tiny group for that. Now, this flag is actually from Brown Shipbuilding in Houston. This was their banner. They built Naval Air Station Corpus Christi. They built 254 amphibious assault ships, 350 naval warships, a partridge in a pear tree. Really, in just over a year, they were launching a destroyer escort every week. I mean, it's like, how'd you do that? So pretty incredible. So amazing agility. Also, some kind of responsiveness to wartime needs. I'll give you an example of Dow, another, kind of popular company in Texas, particularly down in Freeport. They're going to develop Persiplex, which we know as plexiglass. They're also going to develop this foam thing that we know as styrofoam. They develop this wrap to put weapons in so they don't get all messed up while you're assaulting, saran wrap. And then, because aircraft need magnesium, they came up with this idea of building a plant in Freeport to extract magnesium from seawater in incredible quantities. I mean, how did you come up with that? It's an amazing kind of, just intellectual agility and kind of a can-do spirit as people think through those things. Let me come back to the B-29 targeting computer. We talk also about this kind of leap in technology, because the technology at the beginning of the war is not the technology by the end. And this becomes an incredible demand. I'll hit an example here in a second. At the museum, we have the B-17 My Gal Sal. B-17 in the war, we produced about 13,000 of those, but they had 20,000 parts. So 13,000, 20,000 parts. The B-29, though, has 165,000 parts. It becomes the most expensive, complex, and sophisticated weapon system the United States has ever produced. It's more expensive than the atom bomb project. They include in this targeting computer. It's the first analog onboard computer so that you can control the machine guns remotely. If you think about these leaps in technology, it's pretty incredible as you do that. Now, FDR, make sure I don't overrun my time here. I know you guys want to ask me hard questions, right? FDR has after the invasion of Sicily in July 43, some newspaper men kind of, corner him and say, hey, can you explain how this happened? I think they want to know about the actual invasion of Sicily, but instead, he's talking about the mobilization of America. So bear with me. I'm going to read through this because I think it illustrates this. When we send an expedition into Sicily, where does it begin? Well, it begins in 2 places, practically. It begins on the farms of this country and in the mines of this country. And the next step in getting that army into Sicily is the processing of the food and the processing of raw materials into steel, and then the munitions plants that turn the steel into tanks or planes or the aluminum, whatever it may be. And then, even during that process and a long time afterwards, a great many million people in this country are engaged in transporting it from the plant or from the field or the processing plant to the seaboard. And then it's put on ships that are made in this country. Otherwise, you couldn't get it all over there. And it gets on board ships, and then you have to escort and convoy with a lot of other ships and a lot of other planes that are based, most of them, in this country. And finally, when we get to the other side, all these men go ashore. And during that process of getting ready for the attack on Sicily, they're put in effect the training they received before they started. And it's pretty amazing. You know, this idea is every American soldier that goes overseas has to be fully equipped, not only with clothing, but with all the munitions, the rifles, machine guns, artillery, ammunition they need. This is very different than World War I. FDR goes to the front in 1918, and all the artillery, with one minor exception, is provided by the French. And it's like most of the aircraft are French and British. And he's like, well, America's got the strongest economy. Why do we have to use other people's cast over weapons? And so he's really key about, we're going to send people fully equipped overseas. And then obviously you have to re-equip them over there and update their equipment and all that. But ultimately there's no unimportant soldier and no unimportant worker in this system. You know, it all comes together. So let me talk a bit about this. This is Willow Run outside of Detroit. Anybody been up there? You guys been there? That's cool. So this is a dream before the war starts. Henry Ford's son, Edsel, says, you know, we could produce a bomber an hour. Yeah, okay, right. Sure you can. So everybody scoffs, and so they build this plant. It's a mile-long assembly line. It's the largest factory in the world at the time, just to produce this airplane, the B-24. More sophisticated than the B-17, longer range, a little more fragile. But, and then things happen. Oh, man, what happens? Well, we enter the war and we issue rationing. Now you're rationed your gas. So all your employees that were coming from Detroit can't drive to work anymore. Oh, so he's got to build a little town for his workers. And then the Army, in its good fashion, they build a huge assembly line. They have 14,000 modifications of the B-24 during the war. I mean, you'd want an assembly line that you can keep building. So, of course, his critics are like, see, I told you it wouldn't work. So by the spring of 1941, they produced 200 bombers a month, essentially one an hour for the time that the assembly line's open. It's an incredible number as you think, you know, how do they do that in this process? But I think it's amazing as you think about how do they respond effectively to all these different changes and each of the things that come up as they go. Why? Because there's a war on. It's essential. We have to win this. So you remember, you know, FDR calls for 50,000 aircraft, you know, of production for the entire war. By 1944, American plants are producing 100,000 aircraft a year. Ultimately, we'll produce 325,000 during the war. So 6.5 times what FDR calls for initially. And at the time, he said it was not feasible, right? Now, there's one more side of this. We'll talk about Lend-Lease. So it's not just producing stuff for Americans. It's also to produce stuff for all those fighting aggression. And I think that the numbers of it are way beyond what we can imagine. So this is approved by Congress in March of 1941. It's originally intended to keep the British and the British Commonwealth in the war. And then we will add China and the Soviet Union after the Nazis invade the Soviet Union. And then, so ultimately, let's think of the quantities, though. The British Commonwealth, so Great Britain, the Commonwealth countries have about 63%. About 22% is going to go to the Soviet Union. So what does that mean, right? If you said 22%, that doesn't mean much. Now think about it. We talked about Lend-Lease today. We have a new Lend-Lease. It's 31 tanks to Ukraine, right? So in World War II, we sent 10,000 tanks to the Soviet Union, 11,000 aircraft, 12 million rifles, 300,000 trucks, 75,000 jeeps, 72,000 radio sets. Imagine the great Soviet offensives of 1944 and 45 aren't possible without American machines, without American trucks and radios. And then millions of uniforms, 57% of their gasoline, 90% of their railroad stock, and you know, essentially 30% of all their wartime supplies are provided by the United States. Now, the other part of that, because we think about big stuff, we also provide little stuff. So Stalin is even going to later confide, of course, privately, that the Soviet Union could not have remained in the war without U.S. Lend-Lease supplies. And I say that today because a lot of people think, the United States really didn't do anything in the war. Soviets won the war. Okay. But 3/4 of all the ammunition used by the Allies and 4/5 of their high explosives was produced by factories here in the United States. You can't win a war without ammo and high explosives. And, so it's a pretty credible numbers. So finally, American industry is pretty staggering during the war. We produced 76,000 ships in the United States. This is important today when we think about, wow, what can we do? Well, think about what we've done. 86,000 tanks, 40 million bullets, kind of cool. We'll produce 141 aircraft carriers. Of these in the war, 24 are the Essex class. So if you're down to the Lexington, that's an Essex class carrier. There's other small ones, but several hundred submarines, 200 or 800 cruisers, destroyers. Pretty incredible. American merchant ships will haul 52 million tons of war material. I can't even imagine that number. So it's pretty incredible. And in the end, this vision of mobilizing the American economy, the strength of the people, is very different than the Nazi vision. So remember, we talked about millions mobilized for America. What did the Nazis do? 8 to 14 million forced laborers, many out of Eastern Europe and France, and they're supplemented with millions of concentration camp slave laborers. So it's really a vision of the difference between free labor and slave labor in this effort to win the war. And so, I think it's through the efforts of average Americans, American industry, home front, in addition to, those fighting overseas, that confront and master the war machines of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, and really gave fresh meaning to American ideals for the post-war world, that America becomes the standard of that. And so, ultimately, this is an American triumph not only on the battlefield, but in the factories that was decisive. So, in my mind, the legacy of the Arsenal of Democracy is a powerful lesson for us today. The importance of American leadership and vision, an example of what's possible, even when the experts say that it can't be done, and finally, an inspiration of what America can do in the face of adversity. So, thanks for that. I welcome your questions. And only easy questions. Yes, sir.
U.S. government decided not to employ the lights out protocols that most European countries did. And so that number of ships being sunk, how did the people on the Gulf Coast respond to that? I'm sure it did.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think, initially there is no blackout. And in fact, some of the German submarine reports, they talk about they can target the ships because they're silhouetted by the lights of the cities. There's some sunk, just in the Gulf here. They will start, and I don't know, does it become a local civil defense force, or whether there's a larger order to start to impose blackout conditions. There are fears of air attack too, but I think those are, particularly in the first 6 months of the war. Part of the big challenge, you can have the Arsenal of Democracy, but if you can't win the Battle of the Atlantic, you can't get your stuff there. And so, the framework they set out, we got to maintain the Arsenal of Democracy. We have to win the Battle of the Atlantic and the routes to the Pacific, to Australia. Then we've got to tighten the ring around Germany, and then ultimately defeat Germany, and then the idea is to go forward. And so we'll lose about 1,500 ships in the war. The challenge you have in 1942 is we're losing ships faster than we're building ships. And so there's really a sense that this is a war we can lose. What you see, which I think is more decisive than the blackout, just from my perspective, is we start to institute different practices. So more convoying, but also we're using anti-submarine patrols, ASDIC and sonar, using small carriers to extend air cover over the convoys. And then very unpopular, we'll go ahead and ration coffee. Brazil has a bumper crop in coffee, but if you're using ships to carry coffee to the United States, are you risking crews for that? And why I say that, that's the first thing that'll come off the ration list when they start to relieve, rationing controls, is take coffee off the list. But I think the sense that's powerful in that first 18 months of the war, there really is a sense that we could lose this war. And that, all this work on the home front doesn't matter if you can't get it there. So, yes, sir.
Germans actually went up the Mississippi River all the way to Baton Rouge. They took pictures and turned around. In the book, it says one of the things that stopped them. They started having one officer in that 8 or 10 enlisted men in the Navy with a gun established on the victim on each one shoot submarines.
Yeah, and that period, the Germans call that the happy time. That first 6 months. They're actually they get the orders for unrestricted submarine warfare against the United States before Hitler declares war on the United States. It's an interesting, kind of piece. His assumption is America's hopelessly divided. America can never mobilize. We'll win the war before America can do anything to make a difference. And Italy will declare war on the United States as well right after Pearl Harbor with the same idea. Fortunately, they were wrong. Yes. Yeah, it's a great question. So the museum's opened in November. Liberation Pavilion, which was the last major pavilion that really tells the immediate final months of the war, the cost of victory, and the responsibilities of victory. And then recently we opened the Forbes Gallery, which is rare and iconic items. And it also features a kind of interactive with over a dozen World War II veterans, where you can have kind of a conversation with them, where you can come in and say, one of them, for instance, is Lucky Luckadoo from 100th Bomb Group. You can say, Lucky, why do they call you that? And he'll explain that. But then you can say, hey, what was your toughest mission? Oh, it was the mission to Munster. And we filmed them for about 3 days and leave that. So the idea is that, future generations will be able to have a conversation with a World War II veteran as it goes forward. The other piece, though, that we're moving out on, we've got some warehouse buildings we've acquired. We'll create an archival reading room so we can expand the educational piece. We're looking for immersive leadership education opportunities. So I think we'll see that. We'll expand our online content and articles. I mentioned to someone earlier, I'm responsible for historical content across the board. To include the articles, we've had 1.2 million people read our articles in February. And so, now that's not enough. There's more people in America, but, at least it's a start. We got to think about, in addition to the people coming to the museum, which I hope you do, how do people stay connected with it, but also see it as a source that's trusted, that they can turn to for knowledge about the war. And a number of states have World War II education requirements for high school. 23 states, I think, now have Holocaust education requirements. And, there's a lot of disinformation out there. And how do we serve as a source that can be, trusted and reliable, I think is an important aspiration. So that's, I think, where we're going to see more more kind of doubling down on that. A little difficult, it's not as iconic as a new gallery in a building, but ultimately, I think it's an essential part of our mission. As the World War II generation passes away, there's less than 120,000. I think it's our responsibility to kind of, pick up the responsibility of why the war was important, but also why it was important that we won the war and what we produced, what the legacy of that is. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So I'll talk real quick about Liberation, because that's the new pavilion. 3 floors. We do some of that. Of course, it's big, but there's always more you could tell. On the first floor, we look at the cost of victory, and instead of starting with the victory parade, we start with the human cost of the war. And in this case, this first gallery is pretty powerful. In the center is what's called a transit case, which actually brought back the coffin bearing an American soldier who was killed after the Battle of the Bulge, so he could be reburied with his family in Moraine, Ohio. The extent to which we went through is incredible. On the right is a cross from Normandy on loan from the American Battle Monuments Commission. It was over one of the unknown soldiers from Normandy. We still have 72,000 Americans missing or unknown from World War II. You think of that number. And so we partner with the PWMI accounting agency to do research on World War II to try to eke away at that. That's one of the things that I'm responsible for. But it's a pretty incredible piece. Then we set up a piece on the Holocaust and the American liberation of the camps. An incredible number of American teenagers today don't believe the Holocaust existed. But we feature at the close of it, a gallery has kind of film with 23 oral testimonies of Holocaust victims, but also American soldiers on the day of liberation of the camps. Here's what I saw. Here's what we did. Here's what So, I might not believe the internet, but can you believe these Americans' testimony? It's very powerful. And then we have a piece on faith in wartime. Some people find that difficult today, but 60% of the Americans surveyed in the war said their faith increased during the war. 18% said they lost their faith or it went down. And so this faith in wartime is really a powerful aspect of that. And then we cover the kind of monuments, men and women, the preservation of civilization in this war. You can't destroy civilization in the war that you're trying to preserve civilization. But then as you go up to the second floor, because I'll get to your point in a second, then we have a bit of the triumph. The soldiers come home, and then it's time to get to work. What are your responsibilities now at home and abroad in this post-war world? The first is restoring justice, the war crimes trials of the various folks out there. Got some incredible artifacts to include. One of my favorites, it's the keys to War Criminal Prison number 1, which was where those Nazis convicted at Nuremberg and Dachau of war crimes were housed, and then those executed were executed there. This is also Landsberg Castle, where Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. So I love the symmetry. Where the ideas come from is also where we house and execute those war criminals in this process. So we have the keys, pretty incredible. We have a few other artifacts like the hood over Tojo when he's executed. That's pretty grisly, but we won't talk about that. And then as we move then into what's the responsibility of American policy and how is this different than World War I? That you actually have changes at home and abroad. We look at Truman's policies, and then we look at economic and social change in America. How this transforms the economy, we talked about that. How it then transforms American society. And we look at that through the lens of veterans in particular. A couple interesting ones. Jackie Robinson's a lieutenant in tank battalion. You don't think of that, as he breaks the color barrier. Rosa Parks actually works in a defense job in Maxwell Field in Montgomery. on base, she can ride anywhere in the bus. As the base goes off, the bus goes off base, she has to go to the back. As she said, Maxwell first opened my eyes to the alternatives to the ugly policies of Jim Crow. But we don't usually think of the relationship between civil rights movement and attitudes of that. And particularly even the aspect of how, other American soldiers saw the ultimate trajectory of Nazi racial policies and how you realize, you can't go there. And then we'll look at, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Bob Dole, who's going to champion that in the Senate, had been left for dead on the battlefield. And then as a senator, he's really going to champion how do we have, accommodations for people with disabilities from this. And so the war changes America in ways that we don't even fully appreciate. For many American women, certainly you see this kind of second wave feminism, the aspirations that, kind of Betty Friedan and those aspects as well. So we got that. It's not as extensive as sometimes people like, but I think we have to make sure it's tied to the war. And then we look at the changes in technology that come from the war. And, you couldn't have a cell phone or ride in an airplane today without the wartime technology. And then we go, the final gallery on that floor, the last one allows visitors to kind of give their thoughts, but we look at all the presidents who served in World War II and how the war shapes their values. And it gets you up to the first President Bush, which coincides with the collapse of Soviet Union, liberation of Eastern Europe. So it fits well in that. And then the top floor is kind of a multimedia experience that kind of captures the whole piece. So, yeah, we try to do it. It's more challenging than a campaign. Like I know when the campaign in Europe ends because Berlin is captured or Japan surrenders. But, where do you end the legacy of World War II? The real point, I think, is you want people to come in and see some relevance to the war in anything they do, whether it's the American economy, NATO, the creation of the United Nations, American role in the world, you name it. We were instrumental in the leadership that created that. And I think that message is there. Good? Please. So, yeah, so the question's on the GI Bill. So the answer, yeah, on one level, the GI Bill, you can say it's one of the colorblind pieces of legislation in that it's just veterans would receive benefits. Unfortunately, people have to implement those laws, in some cases states, and so what you'll see, African Americans and women are not able to secure GI Bill benefits at the same rate as, white soldiers. And that I think is an unfortunate consequence of it. You do see some, if you think of, for example, Hosea Williams, who's one of the leaders in the civil rights movement. He had been wounded overseas, comes back, actually is beaten while he's in uniform, but resolves to be a general in the battle for civil rights. And he'll use his GI Bill. I think he gets a degree in chemistry, and then will join the civil rights movement. So it's not excluded to everybody, but it is subject to a lot of challenges, and very few women, I think, actually use that. And then, of course, not all the women are considered full. Some of them are considered auxiliaries versus, regular soldiers, which really poses a challenge for that. So it's a good point. On paper, it's an equal law, but it's not equally applied. I think we have the hook.
Actually, we have the train going by, which is a good way to end it. But obviously, you have just scratched the surface of the stories to be told at the National World War II Museum, and we hope you'll come back and share some more with us. We have a small gift for you, if I can find it. from some Texas cufflinks with made with pheasant feathers, and which symbolize protection, power, and prosperity.
Well,
So
thank you very much.